What's up, guys, and welcome to the Photo Finish, Scot Radio's home for motorsports in general and NASCAR in particular. I'm your host, Ben Schneider, and I don't have a co-host with me tonight. Matt's still tied up with men's ministry. God bless him. We're still trying to resolve that, maybe move to a different time slot in the future, but he's busy doing that, and Chase Strauss, who has been on here a couple times, had to work, so it's just me, and honestly, I'm pretty much okay with that because I'm just going to treat this like a podcast and talk right into the microphone and give my thoughts on what was quite possibly one of the worst NASCAR races ever yesterday at Daytona. And of course, I'm talking about the Clash, the annual exhibition race a week before the Daytona 500. So let's lead off with that. And this race was honestly not even a race. It was a complete farce. Like I said, is it the worst NASCAR race I've ever watched personally? I don't know. It's up there. What comes to mind for me is maybe the 2008 Brickyard 400, where the tires wouldn't last more than 10 laps, and we lost track of how many competition cautions there were during that race. And maybe the 2014 July race at Daytona also comes to mind. That, of course, was also affected by the weather and saw two big accidents pretty much take out the whole field. And people have mentioned the race at New Hampshire Motor Speedway in the early 2000s, where they used restrictor plates there, and Jeff Burton literally led every single lap. But aside from that, this was pretty much the worst race I've ever seen. And if you want to know why, it was basically a single-file train of cars, a Monaco Grand Prix-style procession, except unlike Monaco, this is a track with multiple grooves where you run wide open, where you ideally would be able to pass and run three wide for much of the race, if the package allowed you to do that. But yeah, Paul Menard, if you don't know how qualifying for the Clash works, qualifying for the Clash actually doesn't exist. The drivers who each have the privilege of racing in the Clash draw their own starting position, and it's a complete lottery, a random draw. So Paul Menard got lucky enough to the point where he ended up starting on pole and quite honestly led the vast majority of the race. And almost any time a driver tried to make a move out of the single-file train, we saw them pretty much go straight to the back of the pack because there wasn't a lot of help around them. Nobody wanted to go with them. Nobody wanted to make moves. Nobody wanted to run side by side. So that was reason number one why it wasn't very exciting. Reason number two was there was a lot of weather in the area and really just scattered showers. I don't know why they call Florida the Sunshine State. That's a rant for another day. But Rolex 24 last month got absolutely torrential at the end. This race was stopped 3 times for weather. It was only a 75-lap race. To give you an idea, compared to the Daytona 500, that's less than 40% the length of the Daytona 500. Daytona being 200 laps, the Clash being 75. And they had to stop the race 3 times because of weather. And as this third shower was approaching, I guess Jimmy Johnson must have known that this could be the final lap because he was running in second at the time. He got a little bit of a run down the backstretch, and not much unlike last year's Daytona 500, where, of course, Austin Dillon bumped Eric Almirola, spun him out, and he ended up driving off to the win. We had a very similar situation here, albeit it wasn't nearly as blatantly intentional as Dillon's turning of Almirola was. Johnson went to the inside of Paul Menard. Maybe Menard was defending a little bit. He certainly wasn't blocking as much as Almirola was last year. But the two made slight contact, and maybe you could argue that the air sucked Jimmy back up into Paul's car. But anyway, that sent Paul Menard spinning, and unlike last year where Almirola spun out, kind of stayed up high, and the field drove around him, and it was a single-car accident, this pretty much tore up the entire field. There were only about 4 cars that made it back around to the caution flag, and what ultimately ended up being the checkered flag, without damage. So here we are in an exhibition race where pretty much the only aggressive move of the entire event sent the leader spinning, and Jimmy Johnson, who, by the way, made the pass under the double yellow line, which you're also not supposed to do, and NASCAR's inconsistency ruled again because they argued he was forced down there. Maybe that was the right call, but now we have to go back to Talladega in 2008 and give Regan Smith that win that he still deserves. So good job, NASCAR, for even more inconsistency. But regardless, again, another rant for another day. We have this exhibition race that means absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. They're just racing for pride. There are no points. There's not nearly as much money on the line. It's a statistical footnote. Really, the only place you're going to find it is looking at a list of winners of a clash. And yet we have a multi-million-dollar junkyard down in the infield in Turn 3 in Daytona. But what happens when we see the exact same thing on Sunday in the 500, and it's all the backmarker teams who are getting their cars torn up? These are the teams that don't have any sponsorship or minimal sponsorship. These are the teams that maybe don't even have 5 cars, period, back at their race shop. How do they bounce back from this? How do they recover from this? And this is what this kind of racing has continued to produce time and time again. I think back to 2011, I guess it was really just 2011. We saw it a little bit before that. But 2011 was when it really started to appear at Daytona and Talladega. And of course, I'm talking about tandem drafting, the 2-car tango, whatever you want to call it. Racing like that. That, to me, was actually pretty exciting. I know a lot of fans found it boring. A lot of fans didn't enjoy it as much. They thought it was gimmicky. But the reason I enjoyed it was because we saw some very exciting finishes. If you think back to 2011 Daytona 500, Trevor Bayne shocking the world. Maybe NASCAR's greatest one-hit wonder ever. His second career start, he wins the Daytona 500. Talladega, the spring race that year, Jimmy Johnson beats Clint Bowyer by 2/1000ths of a second, ties the record for the closest finish in Cup Series history. And then they come back to Talladega in the fall, and Jeff Burton and Clint Bowyer, the RCR teammates back then, they're able to gap the field so much with that 2-car draft that Bowyer actually had enough time to pull out in a tri-oval and pass Burton for the win. And Dave Blaney, driving for Tommy Baldwin Racing, ended up finishing third in that race. That, to me, is exciting. That, to me, is entertaining. And I'm going to be honest, I've never really been a fan of pack racing just because, to me, it is a crapshoot most of the time. It is a lottery in a lot of ways. Anybody with a basic understanding of a draft can win. And not only that, you see these big, massive accidents that destroy the budgets for all these teams, but the small teams in particular. So it leads me to wonder if this is the kind of racing that we're going to see at the plate tracks from now on, and with this package coming in, is plate racing really worth it with the cars that NASCAR has today? Kevin Harvick came out this afternoon and said if he were in charge, he would just abolish the clash entirely. Personally, what I would do is go back to the days where it was really a sprint race and only run 20, 25 laps and not even hardly give its drivers enough time to tear up the cars, to be quite honest. Make it a true sprint race and probably run it at night, too. If you recall, the 2012 Bud Shootout was probably one of the best races in NASCAR history. But Harvick's arguing that the clash isn't worth it. I'm quite honestly thinking to myself, is plate racing even worth it? If this is what we're going to see on Sunday, I've got half a mind to say, hey, let's just run the Daytona 500 on the infield road course. The Rolex 24 puts on a great show every year. Fans want more road courses. They've been lobbying of it. Why do you think Charlotte turned one of their race dates from a 1.5-mile race into the Roval race? Fans wanted more road courses, and NASCAR has these contracts in with the tracks. They're doing the best they can, but they gave the fans the closest thing to a road course that they could give them. And the Roval ended up being one of the highest-rated, most popular races of the year with a fantastic finish. So I get tradition for tradition's sake. If you want to run the 500, then that's fine. But quite honestly, I feel like they should take the July race at Daytona and run it on the infield road course. And Talladega, if you're Talladega, reconstruct your road course that you used to have in the infield, get that to be approved by NASCAR and run a race there. I honestly think that with the way plate racing is in 2019, that might actually be more entertaining than watching a single-file parade around the high line at Daytona or Talladega, because road course racing has historically, the last few years, put on some of the best racing in NASCAR, and it's what the fans want. You want to give the fans what they're asking for. And you also have to keep in mind we have this new package coming in, which we talked a little bit about last week as well. And I know we saw some great side-by-side racing at Las Vegas and the test and everything, but we're not going to see a full representation of what this package presents until we get it on track, honestly, at Atlanta, but really, I think Las Vegas will be the true indicator. And if we see more of the same, where it's impossible to pass, and the only way to pass the leader is to get aggressive, and sometimes that rubs their bumper the wrong way and sends them spinning, and now we're in a pack, so as soon as the leader goes around, that's 15 cars torn up in a junkyard in the infield, that's not real racing. NASCAR's ratings and attendance are continuing to drop, and they are. I applaud them, at the very least, for trying to find something to serve as a solution for this. But given what we saw yesterday at Daytona, I'm not sure they found it yet. Which leads me to the ARCA race on Saturday, and again, not a very exciting race. I get that these aren't, 2019 package. ARCA has a different package. ARCA has much less experienced drivers, so that changes how they race, changes the outcome of the race. But there were still only 2 leaders the entire race at Daytona. It was Harrison Burton and Gus Dean, who ended up crashing out on lap 78 just before the finish. That's it. Burton pretty much dominated the second half of the race. Never looked back, never lost the lead. And I think back to when we had something like 88 lead changes alone, not just on-track overtakes or passes, lead changes. It was virtually impossible at Talladega, and to a lesser extent Daytona, to hold the lead for more than 2 or 3 laps at a time because of the way the draft worked. And again, that's not my favorite kind of racing because, as I said, it's a crapshoot lottery, but at least that provides an entertaining product to watch, more so than the leader leading this procession around the track and nobody being able to pass him. So Harrison Burton, as I said, went on to score the victory, and because of the late race accident, ARCA actually got a chance to debut their new overtime rules. And if you think back to the ARCA race at Daytona last year, that final lap took well over an hour. ARCA has had this rule where the race has to finish under green flag conditions no matter what, and there's unlimited overtime attempts. So even though you only get 1 lap, it's not like NASCAR where it's a green-white checkered. They throw the green flag and the white flag coming out of the last caution at the same time. And then the checkered flag, the inexperienced ARCA drivers continued to wreck and bring out the caution, and they had to restart and try again, and it really just became this big mess for an hour and a half before Michael Self ended up winning the race. Well, fortunately, ARCA decided to scrap that, save the teams a lot of money at Daytona and Talladega by ideally not wrecking a bunch of race cars, but ironically, they didn't need to because they only needed 1 attempt anyway. The race finished under green. So congratulations to Harrison Burton, again, son of Jeff Burton, cousin to Jeb, nephew of Ward, so part of the Burton racing family. And it was his first race at Daytona, so I think Harrison absolutely has a very bright future in this sport, and it was great to see him pick up the ARCA victory on Saturday night. All right, so let's move into qualifying for the Daytona 500. Now, this took place before the Clash race happened, and Hendrick Motorsports, I don't know what it is about their dominance on restrictor plate tracks when it comes to qualifying, but they have the best single lap speed around. All 4 of their cars ended both rounds of qualifying in the top 4. And it's second-year driver William Byron, who scored his first career pole, and last year's pole sitter Alex Bowman will be joining him on the outside. The rest of the field will be determined by the dual races on Thursday. Of course, Daytona qualifying is a little bit different. But I want to go into how this qualifying format and how NASCAR's qualifying format works again. I know we touched on this a little bit last week as well, but even here at Daytona Talladega, where NASCAR saw that group qualifying really doesn't work because of how much of an effect the draft has, and I think they're going to see that at intermediate tracks this year as well. For some reason, they're still keeping group qualifying regardless, but we'll see how that turns out. Why do we still need 2 rounds of qualifying? If we're just having single-car time trials, and by the way, the cars are only running 1 lap now, you used to really spend your first lap getting up to speed, and then you'd pick up a little bit on your second lap. I guess because NASCAR has 2 rounds, they want to try to make it go by as quickly as possible, so maybe that's the reason for only 1 lap, but it seems silly to me that we send every car out there for just one lap, 1 run, and then we take the top 12, and then we make the top 12 go out again. It seems to me that you could save time, energy, resources by just having each car make a single qualifying run and take their round 1 times and just make that the starting lineup, or I guess not for this race the starting lineup for the dual races on Thursday. But group qualifying has been something that I guess makes qualifying more entertaining, more worth watching. But it's basically a copycat of what Formula One has. Of course, Formula One has 3 sessions of qualifying where they start with all 20 drivers, then narrow it down to the top 15, and then the top 10 fight it out for the pole. And that's fine. That works for them. That's the system that they've had in place for years now, and that's their tradition. So there's nothing wrong with that. But to me, NASCAR has had that tradition of single-car qualifying for so many years, and yes, it's not must-see television exactly, just watching one car go around and set the fastest lap they can. But here's what single-car qualifying did that made me partial to it as a fan of the underdogs in particular. These small teams that are doing the best they can with the resources that they have, running at the back of the pack most of the time, they don't really get a whole lot of TV coverage. And you could argue that that's something that needs to change. That falls on Fox and NBC for not covering them more and focusing on the top guys too often, but it is what it is. This was their chance to shine. This was their chance to have a couple of minutes on national television, having their sponsors on their cars explicitly visible to the audience. This was their moment. And now that we have group qualifying, once again, just like in the races, those small teams with minimal sponsorship are simply lumped in with all the big names that are making qualifying laps during the first round and second round at the same time as them. So you've taken, by taking away single car qualifying and putting group qualifying in, you've taken away really their only moment to have for their sponsors and to get their names out there that they had all weekend. And that's something that makes it even harder, in my opinion, for these small teams to find sponsorship. Because if your sponsors aren't getting TV exposure, if they're not getting media exposure, it makes sponsoring a car much less valuable, and it makes it nearly impossible for the sponsors to get a return on investment, which is already virtually impossible given how out of control costs are to sponsor a car. But now we don't have that moment where they get their spotlight on TV. And so that's really the main reason why I want to see single car qualifying return, because let's give these small teams their chance to shine. Let's not risk having any big accidents. Let's let Formula One do their thing and NASCAR can have their thing. So that's just my opinion, but it is what it is. That's how Daytona qualifying went down, and Hendrick locks out the front row, and Jimmy Johnson wins the Clash. So it's a good weekend for Hendrick so far, and we'll see if they can continue that momentum into the dual races on Thursday. I would imagine that Byron and Bowman probably won't push too hard. You don't want to risk wrecking your car and then losing your front row starting spot by having to go to a backup car and start at the back. So we'll see what they decide to do. But Chase Elliott and Jimmy Johnson are going to be very strong in the dual races, I'm sure. All right, so K&N was at New Smyrna Speedway, which is not too far from Daytona Beach, Florida itself. So it got postponed due to weather, and that race actually just wrapped up within the last hour or so. There's been some news for K&N that I don't think we got to cover last week, but it affects the tire situation for that series. So General Tire, which supplies the ARCA Racing Series tires, they have replaced Goodyear as the tire supplier for K&N East and West. So now K&N will be running a different tire brand than the 3 National Touring Series for NASCAR. I'm not really sure what the reason is for this move. Maybe it's because K&N and ARCA are going to be aligning full-time in 2020 with this new Stock Car Invitational, and of course we'll still see how that plays out, but maybe it's just to start some unification there. I'm not really sure, but it's just an interesting thing that fans might notice this season is the General tires on the cars instead of Goodyear tires. But yeah, so qualifying was canceled yesterday because of the rain, and they waited out as long as they could, but ultimately they had to postpone it to this evening. So they did get a practice in, though. So Hailie Deegan for Bill McAnally Racing ended up starting on the pole because she had the fastest practice speed. But during the race tonight, some eagle-eyed viewers saw on the live stream, which, by the way, this race was broadcast live, which is unusual for K&N, so hats off to Fan Choice TV for doing that. And actually, if you're interested, after you're finishing listening, they're still broadcasting some late model racing going on there. K&N being broadcast live was refreshing to see for us fans of a lower series. We don't get to see that normally too often. So, again, thank you, Fans Choice TV, for bringing us this race. But Deegan wasn't able to pull away to start the pace laps, and it turns out she had an issue with her alternator and more electrical problems similar to what happened to her in this race last year. So unfortunately for her, she got a pretty good start, but fell back to 5th before there was a caution around lap 20 of the race, and then dropped all the way back to 15th of 19 cars. So clearly something was not right with her number 19 Toyota Camry. And when they came down for the first segment break, they put the hood up, and that's when we learned that there were electrical issues going on in the car, and ultimately those were never resolved. And Deegan ended up, I think, finishing in 16th in the garage, again with an electrical issue. So a shame for her. Also a shame for Brittany Zamora, her teammate, the other young female racer for Bill McAnally Racing this year. Tough night for her in her debut. She ended up spinning out twice. The second time resulted in terminal damage for her, so she didn't get to be running at the finish in her debut race. But BMR's third driver, their last driver standing, Derek Kraus, ended up scoring the victory over Ty Gibbs and Brandon McReynolds. So a West full-time competitor spoils the party for the East drivers here at the season debut in New Smyrna. So congrats to Derek Kraus. And as I said last week, he is my pick, honestly, to win the championship in K&N West this year. This is his third full-time season with BMR. He knows all the tracks now. He's proven time and time again that he has this winner-bust mentality, and he's a tremendous young talent, and I personally think that he's going to be unstoppable if he continues to put together good races and doesn't make a lot of mistakes. So look for him to be very strong this season. As well as the other BMR drivers. Hopefully they can get some better results in the coming months. And finally, I guess we'll talk a little bit about some open wheel news. So some unfortunate news coming out of IndyCar today. Pato O'Ward, the Indy Lights champion of 2018, originally had signed a deal with Harding Steinbrenner Racing to have a full-time ride this year for the 2019 IndyCar Series season. Well, he's lost that ride. I don't know if, I guess, a sponsorship issue came up and the funding's just not there. But the Indy Lights Scholarship does provide $1 million in funding to its series champion every year, which pretty much guarantees them about 3 races of IndyCar competition the following season. So it's very likely that we'll still see O'Ward at the 2019 Indianapolis 500. But beyond that, not really sure what he's going to be able to do. And it's very unfortunate because O'Ward got a chance to debut at Sonoma last year, and he looked very, very strong. So it's a shame for him to see that this deal appears to have fallen through. Like I said, I think he shouldn't have a problem finding an Indy 500 ride, but beyond that, it's not looking too good for the former Indy Lights champion. So hopefully something can come together for him. And finally, Formula One had a couple of launches. This week is launch week for many of the teams. I mentioned last week Williams were the only team that hadn't announced their launch date. Well, they launched today as well as Toro Rosso. So Toro Rosso's livery remains pretty much unchanged for the new season, which is a good thing. I think they had a fantastic livery last year. No reason to change or fix what isn't broken. But Williams tweaked it a little bit. Of course, they lost their main title sponsor in Martini last season. They have a new title sponsor in Rocket, which is a telecommunications company. They've replaced Martini, and Williams has actually transitioned to a new combination of light blue and white, which I think looks pretty good. Claire Williams, the team manager, was happy with the launch and everything. And certainly hope Williams can rebound because they had a very tough year last year, of course, finishing last in the Constructors. And George Russell is a great young Mercedes driver with a lot of potential, so we want to see him run well. And, of course, Robert Kubica, everybody's pulling for him, I think, with this incredible comeback again. So hopefully Williams can bounce back. I'm going to be completely honest. I don't know too much of the technical stuff when it comes to these cars, so I'll let the professionals handle that. You can just look that stuff up if you're interested in what might have changed or might have been tweaked on these cars from a new season that might give them a power advantage or maybe prove to be a bit of a downgrade if certain changes don't go as planned for these teams. But yeah, most of the teams will be launching this week, so good to see Williams get their act together and get the launch out of the way today, as well as Toro Rosso. So that's the open wheel news for today, and I think that's going to be it for this week's edition of the Photo Finish. Hopefully I'll have some co-host with me next week to break down Daytona, and hopefully this race goes a little bit better than the Clash did, because let me tell you, if this Daytona 500 is anything like the Clash, it's going to be a disaster for NASCAR because this is certainly going to be their highest rated, most heavily promoted race of the year. But we'll be here this time next week to break down the duels on Thursday and the rest of Speed Weeks with the Truck and Xfinity races on Friday and Saturday, and of course the 500 on Sunday. So for now, I'm Ben Schneider. This has been The Photo Finish, and we'll see you on the next episode.